Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Northshire Bookstore for another virtual event. My name is David Wood. I'm the events manager at Northshire's bookstore in Manchester, Vermont, and I'm here as often with my good friend and colleague, Rachel Person, Northshire's event manager at the Saratoga Springs location. She's going to introduce our authors for us in just a few minutes, but before that, I'd just like to say a few things. We are recording tonight's event. It will be airing on C-SPAN later on. And a note of thanks. It's never been a good time for independent bookstores in the last several years. The last 2 years have been particularly challenging. So we owe it our still existence to your support, and we really appreciate it. All right, Rachel, get to the interesting stuff.
Yes. If you have questions at any point this evening, you can type them into the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, and we will be saving those up and asking them for you at the end of the evening. So please type in any questions that you have there. Tonight, it is my very great pleasure to get to introduce Kekla Magoon, who is here to talk about her most recent book, Revolution in Our Time, which is a National Book Award finalist, a Coretta King Author Award honor book, a Michael L. Printz honor book, and a Walter Dean Myers honor book. She is the Margaret Edwards Award-winning author of more than a dozen books for young readers, including Fire in the Streets and How It Went Down. Most of her books are Northshire staff picks, and she serves on the faculty at Vermont College of Fine Arts. He's going to be interviewed this evening by Steve Sheinkin, a fellow award-winning author for kids and teens and a fellow recipient of the Margaret Edwards Award. His most recent book is Fallout, Spies, Super Bombs, and the Ultimate Cold War Showdown. Please join me in welcoming them to Northshire Presents.
Thank you, David and Rachel. It's very good to be here. Hello, Kekla. Good to see you.
Hi, great to see you too.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank
I'm
you.
pointing to it like people can see it, but I do have it here. Yes, you should always have it with you. And this, I mean, I feel lucky because I've been hearing about it for a long time. You know, we used to see each other out and about at conferences when the world, you know, as of before 2 years ago, obviously. And I heard that you were doing nonfiction, which was very exciting. And then I heard a little more specifically, you were doing something about the Black Panther Party. And this was, safe to say, many years, right? Many years in the making.
Many, many years. You could argue 10, you could argue 20.
Wow, okay, let's hear about
Probably
that.
Closer to 10, that would be more accurate.
And sorry, let's just start at the beginning. It's a nonfiction book, young adult book about the history of the Black Panther Party. Can you just give us a general introduction to it and what brought you to that subject?
Absolutely. So this is the book. It is very exciting and very big. It has so many photos in it, archival photos of the Black Panther movement and a lot from American history, especially Black American history, right? And so this is a nonfiction book about the Black Panther Party. Most people don't know that much about the Black Panther Party unless you grew up in a Black community and a Black family that very specifically teaches about the Black Panther Party. Across the country, especially young people, don't have a sense of this history. Often we have in our minds one single snapshot, Black men with guns, and that often comes with this connotation, bad, scary. In fact, so scary that we often don't even talk about it. We don't put it in the history books. I never learned anything at all about the Black Panther Party as a young person growing up in Indiana in a predominantly white community. Even as someone who loved to read, who loved Black history, who loved to study the civil rights movement, I didn't have any sense of the Panthers other than the snapshot that I described. And so I learned about them in my early 20s so out of college, working as a grant writer in New York City, and I was fundraising for a kids' food program in the contemporary context, and I ran across an article that was about the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program for school children. And I thought, Black Panthers, free breakfast for school children? Like, that does not at all compute with the snapshot in my mind. That's really scary. And so, of course, I clicked on the article, being a curious sort of person, and found out that the Black Panthers had a free breakfast program for school children throughout the country as early as 1969. That is, in fact, the precursor to the federal free breakfast for school children program that was initiated later, following the model that the Black Panthers started. They also had health clinics, and they organized with unions for employment rights, employment justice. They organized with tenants for housing justice. They did all kinds of economic work in their communities, like boycotting businesses that were exploiting either their workers or their community at large. They did so many amazing things in the community that, I mean, that list is really just scratching the surface. They had at least 40 or 50 community programs of different types in different areas. And so I was completely blown away by just that little glimpse I had into what I didn't know about the Panthers. And that started me on this journey of writing both novels and nonfiction about this history, because I think young people deserve to know the truth of our past. And this particular narrative has been really well hidden and deliberately hidden for a long time. So I started writing this book to educate myself. The research came from because I wanted to know. And then once I knew, I felt like I had to share it. It became a calling. It became a responsibility that I felt to share this history with people.
Yeah, I find that's the best way to start is with your own curiosity and not knowing, and then diving in. And you talk about not only is the story undertold, it's really misrepresented, intentfully misrepresented, and not just misunderstood, but mistold. And so did you know from the start that, I mean, you're mainly is it safe to say mainly a writer of fiction? That's what I've read, your wonderful novels. And did you know right away, well, no, I'm not going to, I'm sure you've read Rita Williams Garcia's One Crazy Summer. That's a wonderful, not one of the all-time great middle grade novels set in Oakland, and very much about the Black Panthers. Did you know you weren't going to go that direction right away? I know I want to do this as a full-blown, really ambitious nonfiction project.
I didn't at first, because when I started, I was actually doing my master's program at Vermont College of Fine Arts, where I now teach. And so I was, like you said, primarily a fiction writer. And so that was the lens that I chose to explore first, because I was trying to figure out for myself what even was going on with the Panthers. And one of the things that happened when I learned about the Panthers was it kind of started this teasing question in my mind of who would I have been if I lived in that place and in that time. If I had been alive in 1968 in Chicago or in Oakland, in my mind as a young person, I would have been a civil rights activist. I would have been right there marching with Dr. King, linking arms and singing "We Shall Overcome." And it was only much later that I realized how simplistic the way we even talk about the civil rights movement is. We talk about the nonviolent civil rights movement without acknowledging the incredible violence that was part of that movement. It wasn't violence at the hands of protesters, right? It was violence by police. It was violence by white supremacists. It was violence by people who wanted to suppress the cause of justice. And the power of nonviolence was that people responded with nonviolence to extreme violence, to potentially life-threatening violence, right? To violence that could maim or imprison you, right? People died in the course of this struggle. And so I underestimated what it would have meant to be a civil rights activist in the first place. And second of all, now I had this new idea. What if I actually would have been a Black Panther? It's hard for me to imagine myself carrying a gun, but I can definitely imagine myself feeding kids. I can definitely imagine myself helping to run a health clinic, right? And so it opened up this question. So the first exploration of this that I did was my debut novel, The Rock and the River, which is a novel about a teen boy who's trying to decide about his place in the movement. And so that was me trying to be like, who would I have been if I was in that place and time? But when that book came out, teachers and librarians started using it in the classroom, and it was the first, it came out like a year before Rita's book, and it has a different approach, right, to how you talk about the Panthers. And so both of those books are being used in classrooms. One Crazy Summer is a little bit younger than The Rock and the River. And so both of those books were being used in classrooms, and people were coming to me and to Rita saying, well, we want to teach about the Panthers now. What can we use to teach teens and especially, middle school and high school students about this movement? And there wasn't a lot available at the time. Really, there was nothing that I could point to that would be easy and would be age appropriate and accessible in its entirety. Certainly a capable teacher could put together a curriculum because that's what teachers do, but there was nothing easy. There was nothing you could just hand a kid and say, read this to find out more. And so that was when I started researching in depth to do the nonfiction book. And of course, that was back in 2010. The Rock and the River came out in 2009. And so I started within a year or two of that doing significant research toward the nonfiction.
Yeah, so you weren't kidding that it was 10 plus years. That's pretty normal though. I mean, maybe that's a little long, but I understand. And this is a really huge book, but you have to use some of the same techniques, I would think, as writing fiction. And I'm really obsessed when I write narrative nonfiction with a lot of those techniques, including opening scenes. I just think they're so important. And there's a very dramatic opening in this book. I wonder if you could tell us that story. And also I want to find out if that was one of several options, or if you knew right away, yeah, this is the obvious start of the story.
I considered starting in a few different places, but I always felt that the story that I will tell you now is the place that it was sort of just a pivotal moment. And it's definitely, I think, a common practice in nonfiction. You're certainly more of a nonfiction expert than I am, but I think it's a common practice in nonfiction to kind of pull out a really dramatic, pivotal moment and kind of start with that, and as almost like a teaser at the beginning of the book to say, wow, like this is where we're going, and then kind of pull back and say, okay, how did we get there? And so I like that structure because I think it's exciting and enticing. And so the story that I chose was in May of 1967, a group of Black Panther members and community members drove from Oakland, where the Panthers were based, up to the state capitol in Sacramento, and they had guns, legally acquired weapons, legally carried weapons, and they wanted to protest a gun control bill called the Mulford Act that was being passed largely to prevent the Black Panther Party from carrying their legal weapons that they carried. One of their original programs was called Policing the Police. Now, this was, shortly after the Watts riot had occurred in Los Angeles, and other uprisings had occurred around the country. So this was a time when young people in communities around the country were feeling the rage and frustration of racism, the rage and frustration of police brutality, because the Watts uprising occurred in the wake of an incident of police brutality. And so similar incidents of police brutality had been happening all over the country. The Panthers decided, well, police brutality happens because no one's watching what the police are doing. It happens in dark alleys, it happens around the corner, right? It happens during a traffic stop, right? And so what if we just followed the police? So they would take these legal weapons and a California state law book so they could prove to the police officer that everything they were doing was following the law. And they just followed police officers as they went about their business in the community. If somebody was going to be arrested, they let him be arrested as long as it happened lawfully. As soon as the police officer started doing something that wasn't lawful, pull out the California state law book and say, by the way, you have rules to follow here too. We understand there's a need for accountability and policing. We would like it to look different than it does, but since it looks the way it does, we're going to make sure that you follow it, follow the law. You're not above the law, and you need to treat our community with respect. That was the attitude that they went into it with. But police and white people writ large saw Black men with guns following police officers and thought that was very, very scary. At the time, the organization was called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense because they did not want to cause violence. They wanted to prevent violence. That was their goal. But this Mulford Act that was being enacted by the California state legislature would have taken away their ability to carry those weapons to do the policing the police that they were doing. And so they went to the Capitol to stage a protest. And of course, they brought their legal weapons, and they were allowed to enter the state capitol because they had legal weapons. And they went upstairs trying to get to the gallery where citizens were allowed to watch the lawmakers discussing cases and discussing the bills that were before them. But they were misdirected by media, by people in the hallway who might have misunderstood what the Panthers were up to. It's unclear, but instead of directing them to the gallery, people directed them right onto the legislature floor. And so there are these very dramatic pictures of these armed Black Panthers walking into the floor of the California state legislature, trying to be part of this moment. And so while they meant to stage a protest and sit in the gallery and watch what happened and deliver a statement about systemic racism that was called executive mandate, number one, but the result was many photographs splashed on the news all around the country of Black men with guns storming the legislature, right? Now, that was a little bit of a spin on what happened, but it ramped people up in both directions. It ramped up a lot of white people who said, oh my God, we can't have Black people with guns marching into the legislature, even if they came peacefully and the weapons were legal. They weren't there to hurt anybody. But it also ramped up Black people around the country who said, oh, look at those Black men with guns walking around scaring white people. I want to join that. Let me be part of that. And so that was the moment when the Black Panther Party became not just a small Oakland-based organization, but a national organization that drew followers all over the country, all around the world over the next decade.
Yeah, it's an incredible scene. One of those you just can't make it up things. And speaking of that, Ronald Reagan was there, was physically there, right?
He was at the time the governor of California, and he was giving a press conference on the steps of the legislature when the Panthers got out of their cars and started loading up their guns, because you couldn't travel in the car with the gun loaded, but once you got there, you took it out and load it. So that's what they did, because that was the law. And Reagan saw that happening and fled. And that's why there was so much media on hand, in fact. Because they were there to follow the governor's press conference, but then they turned the cameras to this whole news story that came marching right up the steps.
Yeah, amazing. You just can't make it up. And then, all right, so you have a great hook, a great opening. And then you face the challenge that I think all nonfiction faces, which is where to weave in the background. You know, this story didn't begin in the 60s, obviously in the 1960s. It began centuries before. And you want to focus most of the story starting with the late 60s, but you can't ignore what came before. And you step back then and talk about the past. And I think that it's well done. It's a really challenging thing to do. I would say especially Reconstruction is the part that's maybe the least understood in America. I mean, I feel like people talk about patterns and echoes in history. I feel like it was really clear to me that the Obama years were really, I can't say they reminded me. I mean, I wasn't there in Reconstruction, but there was something similar in terms of it seemed like progress was being made, and then there was definitely a backlash to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think Reconstruction is I think you're right. It's one of the most misunderstood or sort of understudied times, right?
Yes,
we don't study it enough. We don't talk about it enough. It's not as dramatic, right? The Civil War is dramatic.
Right.
And World War I is dramatic, and like what happened in between, right? Like a whole lot of stuff. But we do tend to kind of jump from war to war in our narratives in a way that's, I think, problematic on a number of levels.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so many parts of this that are so relevant and modern, but the party platform, which you have here in its entirety, it's worth reading completely. But I just pulled out one quote from number 5, their 5th point, which is, we want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society. And I just thought that was such an interesting point in the context of what's going on with how we're insanely debating banning books and not teaching, quote, upsetting history today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's eerily reminiscent of things that were happening in that time. Just the struggle to get this history taught was happening in that time. At that time, it wasn't being taught. It wasn't like people were trying to have it not be taught. It was that we were trying to get it taught in the first place. We didn't have a Black History Month. We didn't have an MLK Day. In fact, Dr. King was still alive, right? In 1966 when the Panthers were founded. And part of what drove people to join the Panthers was his assassination in 68, because people said, all right, he's the most peaceful person we have, like, he's our model for peace, for brotherhood, for justice. And even he got shot down. What hope do the rest of us have? Give me my gun, let me fight this, right? And so it was actually, I think the Panthers did a shocking service to the country that people don't totally realize, that they channeled that anger, they channeled that frustration. There were so many young people that wanted to lash out with violence. That's why we saw uprisings around the country. But the Panthers actually said, all right, let's harness this rage and let's turn it toward community organizing. Let's defend our community in positive ways. Let's learn how to use these weapons so that we are using them in self-defense and we are following the law, and they can't come after us. They did, but they had to break the law to come after the Panthers because the Panthers followed the law, right? And so it was a really, I think, powerful shifting of frustration, right, in the wake of Dr. King's death. Anyway, so I think that that's part of why like they became so demonized so quickly, was that people could see that it was an offshoot of the civil rights movement. Yeah. Like it was an equally effective type of organizing that was taking shape.
And you're right that the Panthers desperately wanted to inspire a revolution, and even chose that as their title, Revolution in Our Time, which was something they talked about. I mean, can you? But you also point out that they didn't agree. Not everyone in the Panthers agreed of what that meant.
Yeah, there were definitely Panthers who thought that meant we're working our way toward armed revolution, and there were people in the Panthers who thought Like revolution means change. We don't want there to be bloodshed for there to be change. Sometimes there has to be bloodshed for there to be change. That's something that history has shown us time and time again, right? Our very country in that very moment was sending soldiers abroad to Vietnam and other places, but largely Vietnam at that moment to defend freedom, right? We can send troops overseas to fight for freedom, but Black people can't fight for freedom here on our own soil, where we're living under segregation, where we're living as second-class citizens in many ways, then and still today. And so it's a double standard, right, with regard to whose freedom is worth fighting for, and who deserves freedom in this landscape, right? And we know from studying history, those of us who do study it deeply know that inequality was written into our Constitution. It's written into our laws. It's part of the fabric of the society. And so in order to change the fabric of the society, like that is a revolution, however it happens. It can happen without violence. And that's what the Panthers actually tried to do with all the community organizing programs. They said, this government is not taking care of us. Let's take care of ourselves. What does that look like? How do we channel our power for good? And they also tried to disrupt the system in many ways. But people did not set out to create armed revolution. They set out to defend their community against the violence that was already happening, and to create a revolution that was broader, that incorporates what you talked about with education, right? Like, let us change our minds, let us change our hearts, let us understand the true nature of why we are in the situation that we are in. Let us understand the fiction of pull yourself up by your bootstraps when the fabric of the nation has, do we even have boots? Do the boots we have straps, right? We can't sort of trust the way that the story has been told. And so the Panthers were very much about disrupting that narrative in ways that hopefully would transform society. And I do believe that the majority of Panthers did not want to see violence. They wanted to see this transformation happen peacefully. And structurally, it's difficult to imagine that given the powers that be and the power that they have.
Yeah, another of many parallels to today, especially with the Olympics going up. Maybe the most famous image that people would think of from the Panthers is that from the 1968 Olympics. It was the American athletes who won medals, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, on this podium holding their fists up, which became so controversial.
Yeah.
And of course, reminds you of Colin Kaepernick and other things that have happened much more recently.
Yep.
That was all part of the Panther movement as well. Yeah.
I mean, the raised fist, in solidarity, the raised fist of Black Power is very parallel to, the kneeling, the taking a knee that has happened in more recent times with Kaepernick and others. But there were consequences to that for them, right? They were stripped of their medals because of this act of protest, and it's we can't achieve something and in that moment of glory say, we also want equality, we also want humanity, we also want to draw the world's attention to the things that we need. Like we can't have those moments, right? That's the epitome of peaceful protest, right? I'm doing my best in the world, and in a moment when the world is looking at me, I'm saying I want to be there for everybody else. And to have that stripped from you, to have, to be cut down because of it, that is very emblematic of the constant repression that Black people have been subjected to, and just even the act of trying to say you want equality is punished in some way in this culture.
Yeah, you make a really good point, and even an appeal to young people in the book, and young people today who clearly have the power to change things. The median age in the Panthers was 19, which is really, it was surprising to me. Maybe it was surprising to you when you first learned it. Majority by 1970, the majority of the members were women too, which is also not something, again, if you just have one or two photographs in your mind, that you would picture.
Yeah. I love the statistic that they were very young, the statistic that there were so many women. I mean, because median means if you lined up all the Panthers in a row and you started, from youngest to oldest and then started counting from the outside in, the middle person is going to be 19, which means more than half are less than 19, and probably a good chunk are in that 20 to 21 age range. So it was a big contingent of young people. And I think that that's one of the flaws in the way that we tell history, especially civil rights history. That was also true of the civil rights movement. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was, pastors and things like that, but you had also SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and a lot of other young people. I mean, the people who were marching were college students. They were people in their 20s. There were high school students. There was even a children's march, right? The Children's Crusade, like kids were arrested and put in jail because they marched for civil rights. So it is very easy, I think, to point to somebody like Dr. King and say, well, he was a leader. He was 39 when he was killed. So the majority of his ministry, in the entirety of his ministry, took place in his 20s and 30s. He was considered a young upstart by society. People did not respect him. The establishment did not respect him. Certainly Black people did, but he was not revered in his day in the way that he's revered today. We have written that into our history to try to sort of manipulate the way we feel about nonviolent protest, I think, is part of it. It's really amazing to study both the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement to see that it was teenagers. It was teenagers and college students who were the engine of these movements on every possible level. And when we don't teach that, I think we're trying to disallow teens of today to recognize their own power. How old do you have to be before your voice can matter in the world? I would argue not that old. Look at Ruby Bridges. She was 6 years old. She was the first kid to integrate public school in New Orleans in 1960. She walked in every day and a crowd of white supremacists jeering at her. She went to school because that's what you do. You go to school and you learn and but she's taking a stand for civil rights and doing that at 6. Right? You don't have to be 39, right? I'm 40 and it's like, I still am told, oh, you're so young to have achieved what you've achieved. You're so young to be writing all these books. I'm like, how old do I have to be before my voice matters in the world, right? And so I say the same thing to young people, don't wait for society to tell you you're old enough to matter. You matter right now and you have a voice and you can use it. And so people can use it all different ways. You can write your stories if you're a writer. You can make your art if you're an artist. You can be an activist if you're an activist. You can start an organization. You can lead a movement. We have teens that are so powerful. We all are so powerful at that age. And I do think society deliberately tries to suppress that.
And because they were so young, so many of them, not surprisingly, they're still around. You talked about a very powerful passage in the book, meeting some of them, including Bobby Seale.
Yeah.
Which was incredible. What was that? That was what, 2016, I think you said?
That was 2016, because I went to the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party founding in October of 2016 in Oakland. And they had a big, celebration and a couple of other events and a lot of programming and a museum exhibit at the Oakland Museum of California. It was really an impressive collection of events and days. And so, I met Erica Huggins there. I met very briefly Kathleen Cleaver, and very briefly Bobby Seale. He signed my book and I got my picture taken with him. And I was like, how do you even say what you need to say in that moment? I managed to tell him that I was a writer, and I, told him about The Rock and the River, and that I was researching the Panthers. And he was incredibly generous and kind in listening to me. I felt like he cared and wanted to support what I was doing. And I've met many other Panthers in other times and places. I used to go to a lot of events, of course, over the course of 10 years. Anytime I was in a different city, I would go to the library and see what I could access. And I lived in New York for a long time, and there's a big community of former Panthers there. So I went to a number of film festivals and events and book events, and just a lot of things to meet people and hear their stories, and just immerse myself in the history to the extent that I could. And so many of them are still living. Certainly we've lost quite a lot as well, but there's a lot of Panthers still out there. Yes.
And that brings me to, very logically, to a sort of craft type question, which I always love to work in. There's a mountain. Is it possible for there to be too much to learn? For there to be too many sources out there, too many experts, too many people who experienced these things and did amazing things and are still alive, and you just can't possibly gather it all. Did you feel overwhelmed by how much there was?
Interestingly, that's such a fascinating question, because in some ways the answer is yes. It's overwhelming, but in some ways, all of the awareness who's out there and all of the sort of ability to find them as a person who wasn't already part of the movement, right? To find these people and to interview them or to talk to them or to go to events. It's very easy to find a few who've published their book or who go to events and things, but there's so many that's just the fabric, again, you know, like sort of the fabric of this organization, like it's just out there. And so there certainly are so many more people. And, you know, there's a quote, I'm not going to get it right, but it was a quote from one of the books that I used in my research that was, it's called Portraits of an Unfinished Revolution. I mean, the Black Panther is Portraits of an Unfinished Revolution. And it's a beautiful nonfiction book by Brian Shee and Uhuru Williams. So Brian Shee is the photographer, and he took these portraits of former Black Panthers. And then Uhuru Williams is a historian, and he had written these kind of almost vignette style interview excerpts, like sort of in that person's own voice that followed each of the photographs. And somewhere in the book, there's this quote that says basically, there's no single Panther history, there are myriad Panther histories, because every single person who came to the Black Panther Party and participated in it has their own story and tells that story differently. And so I think that's such a beautiful book, and it's such a beautiful way of talking about the movement. And in some ways, it gave me comfort in writing my version of the history, because while everything in the book is incredibly well sourced and fact researched and everything, like there is an element of kind of pulling together bits and pieces that are often told in different ways, like the same person, Bobby Seale, like I read, you know, as much as I could of Bobby Seale's writing over the last 50 years, and he will tell the same story slightly differently in different places over the decades, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's like, how do I know what's actually true? Because part of it is propaganda in the life of the party, right? They had a way of speaking about things that they wanted people to hear. As time has gone on, they're like, yeah, we had a way of speaking about things that we wanted people to hear. So this is what we said, but this is kind of what it really was, right? But like, there's a reason why we said it that way, and that's important too. And so there was a lot of sifting through like primary source documents that I found that would say one thing, and then a published book that would say something else, and then the guy I saw at the event that would say something else, and it's like, wow. And so that was part of why I tried to pull back kind of as far as I could to really do kind of a biography of the party without getting too bogged down in any individuals. And it's why I relied more, even though I met people and talked to people and I didn't do like major extensive like formal interviews, partly because I just knew I couldn't do that with enough people to get enough of the picture. And so I watched documentaries and listened to, you know, audio, oral histories and all this kind of stuff to pull it together. And just the more you do that, the more you're engaged in this web of just information, there is a kind of meta narrative that starts to rise above it that, you know, I think is as true as possible to the full arc of what the Panthers were, like what they were supposed to be, what they tried to be, how they kind of went wrong in that, how they were come after, you know, people came after them for what they were trying to do. And then, you know, different pockets and different stories help to illustrate that. And, you know, there's always these sort of little red herring stories that are out there that like, how do you ever weave them in? I don't know. It's certainly imperfect because all history is, but it's you know, I do I have in fact a lot of back matter and a lot of like source notes to try to explain. So I'm saying it was this way because this guy says this guy says this, this guy says this, and my sense of the whole thing is probably this. But trying to track some of that, which I see being done in a lot of the adult, real academic style nonfiction too. And so I kind of followed that model to say, this is what I think based on what I've read, and here are the facts, but here's what makes the most sense to me given everything I know.
That's good. Yeah, I think the book is very successful in doing just what you're saying, pulling back and giving the bigger picture while keeping moving, because there's a lot to say. And I have a lot of other questions. I want to hear more about how you molded that mass of research, but I also want to include the audience. So Rachel, should I look at some of these Q&As, or do you want to pop on and choose some for us?
We can pop on and ask some audience questions, absolutely. The first one that we got in was from James, asking, do you anticipate your book being banned, or has this happened already?
I hate to anticipate it being banned. I think I don't want to, I want to believe that no, everyone will read it and it will be wonderful and it will be on bookstore shelves. I know that some of my previous work is already on some of the lists, lists out of Pennsylvania, out of Texas, and various other places that are compiling lists of essentially books by Black authors and books by authors of color, almost regardless of what their content really is. And so given the way that the conversations are unfolding, I would not be surprised at all if this book receives some kind of challenge somewhere. However, you know, that's true of a lot of my books for a number of different reasons. I can't control what people are going to like. I can't control what people want to share with their children. I think it's important that the book exist and that it be available to people to read. But, you know, it's actually possibly like the most emblematic of what we're talking about, right? Because it is, you know, people are saying, well, I'm not sure we want our kids to know about racism. I'm like, here's a book about why we're steeped in racism. So it seems very likely to me that it could become enfolded in those conversations, but I feel both ready for that and that it's important to be part of that dialogue. That's why I wrote the book in the first place, because this history wasn't out there, and I feel like I can make a compelling case for why it should be out there. And you know, there's a lot of people that are standing with me and with other authors in that effort: teachers and librarians, parents, student councils, right? Like so many, and school boards too, right? There are school boards that are supporting our work. We're hearing a lot about the ones who aren't, but that's not everybody. So we're just going to keep going. We're going to keep fighting.
It's just like Platform 5 that you were talking about earlier.
The next question here, it's from David. He asks, can you talk a little bit about the actions the CIA initiated under COINTELPRO against the Panthers, and how successful were they?
Yeah, so there's a whole chapter in the book about the counterintelligence program that the FBI founded, and so that COINTELPRO actually predates the Panthers. It was an FBI initiative that was essentially a counter-communist effort. So it was started as early as the 1950s. And they were surveilling and monitoring people that they felt, this was height of the Cold War, remember? So, the idea of communism was a real threat to the American establishment in that moment and in that time. And so they were monitoring people that they felt were propagating communist ideas. And so all of the civil rights movement fell under that heading. And so Dr. King and his companions and co-workers, and Malcolm X and his companions and co-workers, like all of those people were surveilled under this counterintelligence program that was nicknamed COINTELPRO. And so the majority of the counterintelligence program operations that occurred over those few decades actually did target the Black Panther Party. So this was all stepped up significantly after Nixon was elected, and J. Edgar Hoover released a memo saying, all right, we cannot allow the rise of what they were calling Black extremist organizations, Black nationalist organizations. And they included not only the civil rights organizing, all the civil rights organizing groups, but also the Black Panthers and various other groups who were organizing. They said they wanted to prevent these groups from organizing and gaining membership. They wanted to prevent these groups from taking any kinds of actions. They wanted to prevent these groups from developing new leaders. They wanted to prevent specifically the rise of a Black messiah, someone the likes of Dr. King, who's widely respected and an incredibly powerful speaker and organizer, somebody like Malcolm X, who is an incredibly powerful speaker and organizer. And so they saw a lot of the leadership of the Black Panther Party as having that potential, especially somebody like Fred Hampton, who was the Chicago chapter leader and the Illinois chapter leader, who was ultimately assassinated by Chicago police and the FBI under this counterintelligence program. That's probably the most extreme example of how the counterintelligence program sought to disrupt the Panthers, was actual assassinations. But they also conducted surveillance. They sent spies into the ranks. They paid people to be informants on the Panthers. They conducted raids legally and illegally of Black Panther offices. They let's see what else. They burned the food from the breakfast programs. I mean, this was just a lot of unlawful acts on the part of police and FBI in service of disrupting these Black organizations. And the Black Panthers were following the law. I mean, they were very respectful of the laws. They were attempting to work within the system. They're ironically, right, civil rights activists were engaging in civil disobedience, so breaking the law on purpose, knowing they could be arrested. But the Panthers were actually acting under the law. And so when you act under the law and the powers that be don't like you, they have to step outside of the law in order to get you. And so that was what was happening. We saw a lot of illegal surveillance, a lot of illegal you could call it breaking and entering, but breaking into places without warrants and things like that. And it was actually an incredibly successful effort. One of the things they did was try to just foment disagreement. They sent false letters back and forth. I mean, this is long before cell phones. You couldn't pick up the phone and text your bud, right? You would send him a handwritten letter across the country. And so it was very easy to forge those and create distrust and dismay among people. And so they were incredibly effective in breaking up the organization and picking at little, when there's little fault lines that just get expanded. And they were really, really good at that.
The next question came from Kathy asking, were there any stories that you found in your research that didn't fit or were inappropriate that you couldn't include?
Could you, I'm sorry, it's breaking up a little bit for me. Could you
asking about stories that either didn't fit or you decided were inappropriate for whatever reason in the book?
I mean, there's many stories that didn't get included just because you can't put everything in. Yeah. There wasn't much that I would have deemed inappropriate. I believe in being honest with children and talking about difficult things. That's really what this is about. I think there are probably a few things that were deemed adult. I mean, there were, violence against women that happens across society is something that happened, within the party, not because of the party, but because it's something that happens across society, right? And so that's something that a lot of people focus really hard on when they talk about the Panthers, because they want to say, oh, this organization was, full of, people who treated women badly. And it's actually not true. First of all, it's not true. And second of all, yeah, there were some people, men in particular, who treated women badly within the party because that's our society, right? And so it's very easy to, I think, to look to things like that to demonize a group that was a Black-led group, right? And so I steered away from some of those topics. I mean, I do address it in the book, and I talk about it in the back matter as something that people talk about in relation to the Panthers. But I just felt like it wasn't what I wanted to spend my time on, and also it's not. It gets into a lot of complicated issues that are adult, I thought. So that's kind of the one area that I didn't go into. There's so many wonderful stories that I didn't include for one reason or another that had to do with just a sensibility about it that felt off, or something that doesn't really have anything to do with trying to protect kids. It's just trying to tell a narrative that makes sense and is really clear without going into a lot of digressions. The one story I can think of that I really debated hard about including, and so this is possibly the best example of something that didn't make it in that could have, was I said under the COINTELPRO, police and FBI did a lot of illegal raids of Black Panther offices. And so there was one Black Panther office that the police officers were repeatedly trying to raid, and kept failing to succeed at raiding the office because there was a dog in the neighborhood that was penned near the Panther office. And so when they would come sneaking up the back alley to break into the Panther office, the dog would start barking, because the dog always barked when everybody came in the alley. And then the Panthers knew that something was happening, and they could run and deal, And so the police couldn't attack this location. So, and I hate to say it because I know how people feel about animal death, but what did these police officers do? They killed the dog, because then they could sneak in and break into the Panther office. Now, I thought about including that narrative because it shows you the cruelty, right? The cruelty of what COINTELPRO was that we can march up this alley. We're so heartless that we're going to kill this dog in the process of getting to these Black people. this is an entire book about how they're coming for the Black people, right? Why can I write that whole book, that 400-page book, and the most upsetting anecdote in that book is going to be they killed a dog so they could get to the Panthers, right? And so to me, I find that such a fascinating, it's a fascinating story because it illuminates something, but the way it illuminates something and the reason it illuminates something is also very telling about the subject matter, right? But to put that story in and to talk about it in all the ways that I just tried to contextualize it briefly here is a whole digression away from the story, right? And so I ended up leaving it out because it was hard I couldn't find a place to fit it in that didn't feel like, okay, let me just take a step out here and talk about why we're sadder about an animal than we are about Black people. Like I couldn't make it work in the narrative. And I did try, but I couldn't make it work in the narrative without, I felt like derailing a larger point.
I'm curious how you did organize all this stuff. You must have had hundreds of pages of notes or computer files, and it's different then, isn't it, from writing fiction where you can imagine yourself into and out of situations. How did you physically organize it all before you, or as you sat down to write?
If you're looking for an answer other than total chaos.
Total chaos is a good system.
It is not great. So I did have, again, I worked on this for a long time, and I had, tried to publish it years ago and couldn't because, the world needed a little more time, I think, to be ready for it and such. But so I had, sort of first round folder of research, big binders with the clear sheets with the top hole in it, and you can slide the papers that you made copies of at the archive into. So I had several of those kind of binders. I had notebooks because a lot of the archives that I went to, you can't bring your laptop. You can bring maybe a camera, and you put on little white gloves, and they don't even let you bring a notebook. You can bring flat, plain sheets of paper. Because they just don't want you to smuggle anything out, basically. So you have to go in with like a little tiny pencil and these white sheets of paper and these little gloves, and then you come back out and they like sift through your paper to make sure there's no like archival cool photo like hidden in your stuff. So I had all those little papers that I had handwritten notes on from the archives. I had photographs that I had taken from the archives. I had photos of like museum exhibits that I had gone to, because really this was the scope of this book was so massive because it wasn't just the Black Panthers, it was also the Civil Rights Movement, it was also all of American history as told through the lens of Blackness. So, I visited Selma and Montgomery. I visited, the museum in Greensboro, North Carolina, where the lunch counter sit-ins had taken place, like just a whole bunch of things. And so I had all these photographs and documents and like little noted Post-it notes. I'm a big fan of Post-it notes. I always have some Post-it notes in my pocket. So it's like, and so I spent a lot of time kind of just sifting through all of that. And then by the time I was actually writing this version of the book in like 2018, 2019, there was so much more available online than there ever had been when I started back in 2010. I mean, just that it's almost exponential, the amount you could find about the Black Panthers online today than what you could find in 2011 when I started this. And so I have folders on my computer of like PDF downloads from various websites so that I could keep track of what, you find something online, you can never find it again the next day somehow because it came up in your search, and then you can't. So I learned very quickly that I need to PDF copy everything if there was something I gleaned from it, so that it would be in my computer. So I have all of that, and then the photos are their own whole super fun adventure. But yeah,
that's fascinating. It was the first draft that you wrote. Was it as messy as a first draft for fiction would be, or was it more focused because it had to be, you had the timeline, you had the information?
I would say it was a lot more focused. I mean, the very first draft of this I wrote was back in 2013 that I wrote it. So yeah, because again, like I tried to publish it. It's been a road. But it was always structured, because when I sold the book the first time, it was an outline, like a proposal and an outline. And so I had done maybe like 2 or 3 chapters, and then I had bulleted out kind of what would be in the rest of the chapters. So I had that material. And so I really just kind of followed that structure and wrote it out that way. And then when I rewrote it, like 5 years later, I drafted the full novel the full nonfiction at that point. And then I redrafted it 5 years later by essentially looking through all of that, circling the parts I thought I liked, and then sort of adding and reworking and fleshing out and condensing and all of that kind of stuff. So I already sort of had an outline when I really sat down to write this version as well. So I never felt like it was messy on the page. It was just messy in my head and messy in my workspace.
So a different sort of challenge from writing fiction.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, I'm going to jump in. Tabitha, do you have another one you're about to ask?
We do. We're getting towards the end of time, but there's a great question here from Emma that I'd like to ask. She says, how did the writing and research of this inform your understanding of what's happening today? Did it change the lens through which you view what's happening in the news? Are you more or less hopeful?
I mean, so in terms of context, I had written a draft of this in, I think I completed it in 2019, but I was revising it in the spring of 2020. So beginning of the pandemic, I was heavy into the photo research on the book so like trying to find the photos that were going to go in the book when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And so it was odd to be like searching for images related to the Watts uprising and also I guess Rodney King in the 90s and then watching literal uprising taking place like on my TV. Like I was sitting on my couch when Minneapolis was in flames, literally researching photos. I mean, it was bizarre in many ways to be seeing it. It was very upsetting, obviously, as it was upsetting for a lot of us to be seeing it. And also it was utterly unsurprising because I've been so steeped in this history to see that it is cyclical and it keeps happening, it keeps coming around, it keeps coming around. We have police brutality, we have uprisings, and then we have youth organizing, and that is what we have today, right? And so I felt both energized. Obviously we don't want these things to be happening, but I felt energized in the ability to put this book out in that moment. Like I kept rewriting and adding to the author's note at the end to be like, and now here's what's happening. And now, and at some point you have to cut it off. Right. And so I was careful about that. I was like, okay, I'm writing this on this day. This is when I'm writing it. It was all done before January 6th. Like it was done. I didn't go back and add anything related to that. But it definitely draws my attention to the cyclical nature of these issues, right? The fact that you can read the 10-point platform of the Black Panther Party and every single point on those, every single point on the 10 points is something we're still working on today. It's it's upsetting. I mean, I don't even really have words for it. I made 400 pages worth of words for it, which is essentially like, we have to understand what has gone before because it's going to inform how we move forward. And it's never going to look like the Black Panther Party. It shouldn't. It should look different, right? Because it's a different place and it's a different time, but it's also steeped in the same thing. And we can learn from their mistakes. We can learn from what took them down. We can learn from what worked well for them, right? I feel like all of that is so important for young people right this minute. And so, I don't think it changed anything for me. I think I've been ahead of the game on that because I know that, for 10, 15 years, I have known that this history is really important because of where we are now. And it took the rest of the world up until 2020 to catch up to that realization. And so it is like, I don't feel changed. I'm certainly changed by the experience of writing the book, but I don't feel changed in my understanding of contemporary race relations by the things that are happening right now. I feel empowered to speak about them. And I feel like the time is right to have those conversations with young people all across the country, in communities, in schools, in libraries, anywhere you can.
That's great. So do we have time for the obvious last question, which is what's coming up? I mean, you must be working on other projects right now, right? Can you talk about them?
I am, yeah. So the next book that's coming out is a novel. So it's called Chester Keane Cracks the Code. And it's about as far from the Black Panthers as you can get, but it's a middle grade novel about a boy who is training to be a spy, but it's also about friendship and belonging and family. And so that book is coming out in July from Random House. Chester Keane Cracks the Code. So that's the next one that's coming out. And eventually I will do a cover reveal probably soon. But if you're really excited, I'm pretty sure the pre-order link is already up and you can go check it out. I don't know if it's on the Northshire website yet, but it might be soon. The other thing that's coming is a graphic novel series that I'm co-writing with Cynthia Leidig-Smith, and it's called the Blue Stars series, and it's about two sixth grade cousins who become superheroes in their community. And the first book is called The Vice Principal Problem, and it comes out in spring 23. So those are the two nearest things. Oh, yay! Rachel found the pre-order link for Chester Keane, and you can see the cover. I'm guessing. I didn't actually click the link, but
that's a great cover. I love
it's such a cute cover. So I'm excited about that. So yeah, and Blue Stars doesn't have a pre-order link yet, but it's coming in spring 23. So those are the next things.
That's great. It's great to have a mix of things. You couldn't do another book like this, right? Like the Panther Party, right after doing it. There was just,
I don't even know how you do it. You do all these books.
Yeah, just you have to change pace. And I especially love that you're doing graphic novels, which I'm getting into too. And it's such a nice change of pace from other kinds of writing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's so much fun. And I love co-writing with Cynthia. You know, she's such an accomplished writer in her own way, and we bring different strengths. And she's much more of a comic book expert and graphic novel expert than I am. I mean, I'm becoming more knowledgeable in the course of working with her, but it's just so neat to just have a slightly different approach to the creative process on every level, to be working together, to be doing graphic script, to be, working with an illustrator and looking at things visually. I mean, to have work that's illustrated, that's really my first time having things illustrated. I mean, this is illustrated in the sense that I searched archival photographs, but that's different. It's different than having an artist bring your work to life in a particular way. That it's just, there's nothing like it. I'm so excited. So.
Awesome. So are we almost out of time here? Can we sneak in another one?
Here's that we are.
We are in fact out of time.
Okay.
But thank you both so much for being. I think David is actually going to take us away because my internet is being wonky.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Steve, Kekla, thank you both so much. Their book is Revolution in Our Time, the Black Panthers Party's Promise to the People. You can order it at northshire.com. And thank you both so much for being here and joining us tonight.
Thank you, and congratulations, Kekla.
Thank you, and congratulations to you for your award as well.
Thank you. Thanks. Here's to seeing each other in real life someday.
Absolutely. I hope we get to meet soon, perhaps at AMA.
Yeah, soon.